If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, we are back and I can tell you we've got a former officer in the South African Defence Force here with us. He served in 32 Battalion, you know, that's probably the most famous infantry unit ever. Part of the Angolan border war between 1966 and 1989. He's also a practicing lawyer and a historian. And he completed recently a master's degree at the University of Pretoria. And that's a fantastic master's degree, because I can tell you when I spoke to General Delport, Mick Delport, the last commander of 32 Battalion, he actually told me about the master's degree. So it must be very good. So Marius Scheepers, you're welcome here with us. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. I must say you're looking like an officer as you sit there. We are impressed. And now it's over to you. Please tell us, where do you come from? What happened to you? Just tell us your story.
Yes, thank you, Chris. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you. Thank you for inviting me. I must say, bom dia, good morning, in the proper fashion. Yes, Chris, it is now 40 years ago this year that I was actually selected to do my national service or my conscript in the South African Defence Force. You won't believe it, I was at the young age of 17 years when I started my military service. Now, those days you were recruited and you ended up in a base, and I was actually selected to go to the Corps of Signals. The Corps of Signals situated at the Army Gymnasium. Now, the Army Gymnasium is a very interesting base. It is a lot of culture and history. That you think about the West Point in the US. So the Army Gymnasium was a base where the signalers in the South African Defence Force were trained. So in 1982, arrived there. To become trained, you had to do a 2-year national service conscript. And the first year was divided into 3 parts. So first of all, you had to do your basic training for about 3 months. Now, let me tell you, the Army Gymnasium had the biggest parade ground in the Southern Hemisphere. It's huge, and we had to march and drill for weeks and weeks in our platoons. A platoon is about 29, 30 people. So you had to be absolutely perfect the time we spent there. We were super fit. You had physical training with physical training structures every day. Believe me, you were almost dying. And we went through all the motions. After your basic service, obviously, if you're fortunate, you get selected for a junior leadership course. That was for 3 months. And that's really when the heavy stuff started. Because at the end of that course, you either become a non-commissioned officer, a corporal, or you become an officer, a second lieutenant. So the stakes were very high. Now, if I think about my training days, the camaraderie and the people you met there, it was a lifetime friendship. We had interesting times together. At that stage, the Defence Force decided they want some form of a sports event. And they started something they called bundle sports. Now, in English, that is a group sport. So each unit had to select its best platoon. And the bundle sport was like the Olympics, where you had to compete against other units with pole PT, carrying heavy logs. Baddie PT, carrying your baddie in all sorts of ways, like a baby over your shoulder. and all sorts of activities to test your strength and endurance. Now, my platoon, I was fortunate. We won our competition at our base. We went to the aerial part. I think that was around command. We managed to win that one, and we found ourselves at the national competition in Verdraghoogte. And let me just repeat. They didn't select the best guys in the unit, they select the best platoon. So we were, 12 people, it's actually a section, and we stayed together. And I'm quite proud to say, at that national competition, first and second spot was the parabats. Obviously, those guys were super fit. There was an infantry battalion coming third, and my group came fourth in the national competition. So just to put us on the map, that means the Army Gym's training and our abilities was up there, competing with everybody else. So also during JLs, we had a lot of field duty and training in the field. Remember, a signaler, they have to master the skill of creating communications under any conditions. At night, under severe stress. One of our training sessions, we had to establish air-to-ground communication with the Air Force. Now, close to Heidelberg is the Natte, that is where the Harvard training school is, the old Second World War aeroplanes. So they flew by, and we had to call them on the radio, and then somehow our skills were tested to guide them into our location. But there was a surprise installed for us. These Harvards carried under their wings flower bombs. So the moment they spotted our platoon, there was a surface-to-ground attack, and believe me, they shelled us with that flower bombs. And if one of that bombs landed in your head, my friend, I think you will have concussion for the rest of your life. So we scrambled, and everybody was white because of bursting flower bombs. I think that was a yearly tradition, and I think the South African Air Force guys had a great time and amusement because of that. So yes, we then started our candidate officers course. Now, I need to mention the intake in Heidelberg in 1982 was 1,100 soldiers. From that group, only 31 soldiers were selected to become officers. There was also a group of 60 electronic engineers, but they automatically were eligible for become officers. They also did the training with us, but only 31 guys were selected. Now, we did our training under very good leadership, and the leadership skills was very important. You must understand, the signal officer is very exposed. You end up in headquarters and working with top brass and top officers. So you must have a good leadership quality. Now, Commandant Reineke and Commandant, I will always remember his name, Hermanus Yuri de Wet, because he announced his name when we were in trouble. He was an operator at the Special Forces, and he was our course leader. So we had a very strict training. Now, at the Simple Corps, there were a lot of subjects. So the training involved a lot of memorizing and examinations and writing tests. Now that you have to master while you also do physical stuff. So at the end of the course, I managed to complete that. I remember we were tested in all sorts of areas. One such area was when we actually did also a field exercise, and we were kept awake doing all sorts of tasks. And I managed to keep awake without sleep for 5 days. Now, I must admit, you get to know yourself very well. And after the 5th day, my mind just switched off, and I was like a vegetable. You could do nothing with me. But I managed to keep up and going, and perhaps that sort of counted in my favor. We also had to go without water for 3 days, died dehydrated without water. You really are tested if you understand the value of survival in the bush. So yes, at the end of the training, Colonel Smith was the officer in command. He called us all to his office at Army Gym, and everybody got assigned their units. At the end, 3 people remained behind in the room. And we know, well, we're either in trouble or something is going to happen. So the one guy was assigned to go to the Bushman 201 Battalion. The other guy was selected to go to 61 Mechanized Battalion. These are very important units in the border. And then at the end, I was the only person remaining. He said, well, my friend, you can decide if you are happy and satisfied, you can go to 32 Battalion. Now, obviously, I know nothing about 32 Battalion. Nobody knows anything about 32 Battalion, but all I realized is this is going to be a very difficult task. So I left the States from Waterkloof. We boarded a freight aircraft, left behind my family. My girlfriend, she left me at that stage. That made it quite easy because then you can focus on the task ahead. So yes, you asked me about my family. I came from a military background. We are 3 brothers. We were all officers. I was the youngest brother. All officers in the Defence Force. My father was a chaplain. And he served as a Defence Force for 20 years. So there was a bit of encouragement. But at the end, I think I felt a duty and a responsibility, and I wanted to serve and do my best as I did the first year. So therefore, we were heading towards the 2nd year of national conscription, and I arrived at Rundu. Now, Rundu is at the border of Angola. It's sector 20, where 32 Battalion's headquarters is situated. When I arrived there, I was told that there's big trouble in Angola, and there's no time to spare. I left everything behind. I didn't have any personal belonging. So I grabbed a kit. I got issued with a big backpack. We call it a mochila. I had a selection of arms. I decided I'll rather go for the AK-47 because that rifle had very little maintenance. And 32 Battalion believe that if you are in a battle situation, there will be ample ammunition and resupplies around because the enemy also carried those weapons. So I boarded the Dakota old aircraft, taken from Rundu sector 20 to sector 10, where Oshikati and Ondangwa is situated, where I got my instructions, and immediately I boarded a Puma helicopter, and I was flown into Angola. Now, because I'm a historian, I was always interested to know where did I fit into the bigger picture. So in 2012, I managed to write a book referred to as Striking Inside Angola with 32 Battalion. Now, I realized that my period in Angola was a very important period, and a lot of things happened, but I needed to understand what the meaning was of serving there. So this book was published, I'm quite fortunate, by Hillian in London and 3 Degrees South in South Africa. And the book was really about 1983, which I think is a pivot year. It's a high point of the Defence Force involvement in Angola. Now, looking at the war, the war lasted for 23 years. It started in 1966 to 1989. So 83 is probably in the middle of the war years. Why is 83 important? The SADF started badly, I think, in the 1970s. At some point in 1977, 78, the killing ratio of enemy soldiers was not that high. And we had to deal with landmines. So the Defence Force started to deploy sophisticated military equipment. So you had the Rattle infantry vehicle. It's an armored vehicle. You had the Buffalo vehicle that is used for light infantry. And they were all mine-detected vehicles. So to conquer the threat of mines, we were more successful at that time. In 81, you had big operations like Operation Protea. That's when the Defence Force with the Rattles deployed probably for the second time, managed to clean the 7 central parts of Angola. So they take the capital of the Kunene province, that's the southern province of Angola, a place called Onjiva, that's the capital in the Kunene province. To the east, you got the Kwandu Kabangu province, where UNITA was situated. And let's talk about that. So Angola became independent in 1975, and the MPLA was a Soviet-orientated force, managed to get hold of the capital center in Luanda. There were 2 other rebel groups, FNLA and then UNITA. Now, UNITA played a major role in the war up until the end. So you had UNITA deployed in the southeasterly corner of Angola, at Jamba. And at some point, they had control over 25% of Angola, and perhaps 50% of Angola, they played a major role. So they were fighting a war against the MPLA to compete to reign in Angola after the civil war started. So South Africa was caught in between. So you had 2 wars that South Africa was involved in. Our prime enemy was SWAPO, the South African People's Organization. They wanted to liberate South Africa and Namibia, and they had a military wing called PLAN, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia. So their aim was to fight the South African Defence Force. The liberation of Angola was not the South African Defence Force priority. But you should understand it was in South Africa's interest that UNITA kept their ground, because if UNITA was out of Angola, suddenly the borderline South Africa had to defend, which was 480 kilometers, would extend over 1,500 kilometers. And it's an impossible task. So we were more and more dragged into the war. There were a full-out war in 1975, Operation Savannah. I'm not going to talk about that. South Africa withdrew. Now, the Angola war probably consisted of 6 stages. And in my second book, I managed to, as you mentioned, my master's degree, and I published a book with the title Move the Border in 2020. That is after I completed my master's degree, on the subject of the Battle of Dingo. We can talk about that later. So, Move the Border subtext is a history of the greatest battles of Angolan border war. So I realized that nobody managed to go into detail to all the major battles. So if you want to look at a 23-year-old war, how do you understand that war? How do you define a war of that length? So it was my aim in my book to divide the war into, let's say, 6 different stages. And I realized the head of SADF, Jannie Geldenhuys, mentioned general operations and Pacific operations. Meaning general operations, South Africa was always busy with operations. There were about 300 names of general operations. But your Pacific operations, the operations that changed the outcome of a direction of a war, that served interest. So I managed to do a thorough study of a whole war, and I came across probably 20 such specific operations. And it was my aim to define the war, the 6 stages, and then to look at those battles. And you won't believe it, Chris. At least 2 of those 20 battles were never described before. To come across a huge battle, which is part of the Cold War history, and nobody knows anything about it. The one battle, over 5,000 troops participate in that battle. That's Askari at the end of 83, and we'll get to that. And all that was mentioned is one sentence in a news article that said the South Africans went past a place called Cuvelai. They were offended by a small SWAPO group, and they attacked this group, and they secured Cuvelai on their way to Tetsmetet. That's it. Now, that is so far from the truth. That was one of the biggest land battles in the middle of a war, with tanks and armored cars fighting against each other. And the war lasted for 3, 4, 5 days. But we will get to that at the end. So that was the end of my participation at the border in 83. Just to describe to you, the other battle was Operation Firewood, which South Africa lost the most. We had the most casualties in one day in the war. Now, why would such an event never be described and you never hear about Operation Firewood? That was the topic of my master's degree, and I managed to to unravel that story as well in my master's. And all that reached a book. So now there's a book describing the military side. So I'm not interested too much in the politics. Politics play a role. But let's talk about who were the generals and the officers in command and the troops, the brave ones. How did people die? And how does all fit together? Very important. If you come across a regular soldier, he would tell you where he was and what he did, but he doesn't know where he fit in. And 40 years afterwards, you talk to civilians who were in the army, and you can actually direct them to where they were and the role they played. And that's important for a person's self-esteem, to understand the part he played, and to create a bit of pride and honor in that as well. So that is really the reason why I think a historian needs to tell the story and tell the truth as accurately and precisely as possible. Right, so 1983, South Africa is at the top of its game. We had a huge area, 200 kilometers north of a border. You had the central theater in the middle of Angola. You had at the bottom of a border Ovamboland. That is the main area where SWAPO wanted to get involved in. So you had to keep SWAPO out of Ovamboland, and north of the border was Angola. So at the beginning, we fought in what we call the shallow area, about 5 to 10 kilometers north of the border. Because remember, South Africa was not allowed inside Angola. The moment you breached the border, there was an outcry at the United Nations, and sanctions, a lot of punishment followed. So for all purposes, South Africa was never in Angola. But that is a big lie, because we were very, very active in Angola. But that's why this war was kept under the covers. It was a secret war. People in the States should not know that there's actually war going on. And that was all the purpose of a war, to keep it secret, and that South Africa don't suffer, our international image is not damaged. So, yes, 81, 82, 83, South Africa had a huge force. So, on Jiva, I mentioned in Jiva is the capital of Kunene province. There's a big international airport we took on Jiva during Australia in 1981. So I boarded my helicopter and I landed at the Tactical Operations Headquarters at Onjiva. Now, Onjiva is the terminal, the airport terminal is a depleted building. It suffered a lot of damage. But we managed to erect a signal room, an ops room inside the building. And when you had access to this landing strip, it was a tarred landing strip, a very, very large airbase. The landing strip was about 1 kilometer, so you could almost any aircraft can land there. So it's a very strategic place to be inside. So 32 Battalion was given the task to work inside Angola. At some point, we also had the parabats there, and they were supported by mortars from State President Guard was there sometime, and then people from the South African infantry units. I'll talk about them later. So 32 Battalion was actually in the forefront. And 32 Battalion, even if you read my book, you realize, without making a big fuss, 32 Battalion was just there when things took place. Now, we in the Cold War area, it's the East against the West. On one side, you've got United States and Western Europe. On the other side, you have the Soviet Union. And if you read the news these days, it looks like Russia more and more looks like the Soviet Union. We're almost back into a Cold War. But that was a serious Cold War, a serious threat between East and West, with the Berlin Wall standing in the middle. You understand that history. So the major superpowers competed each other. And I think Angola became one of the battlegrounds where you found Angola forces. They were backed by the Soviet Union, the Russian forces. So they get all the military equipment, and a lot of it. Anything you can think of. MiG-23s, 21s, T-35, 34, 78, and the T-53, 54 tanks. I mean, those were the prime war machines. The air defense system, they deployed the SAM-9 and SAM-8 missile system. The SAM-8 was not known in the West. The West didn't know what the SAM-8 is capable of. So if you develop an aircraft, your aircraft must be better than your opponent's missiles. So I think the West was very worried what the SAM-8 can do. And the SAM-8 was right there waiting for us, for our Air Force, if we flew over Angola. So it was a serious war. It is not a child play. So you should understand the effort that goes into that war. South Africa's President P.W. Botha had the Security Council, and everything in South Africa was directed at one aim, and that's the security of South Africa. So all decisions made in political level was about the security, which people refer to as the rooi gevaar, or the danger of the Russians coming to South Africa and then start here a communist socialist system. So South Africa was very wary of the threat that's coming from the north. But then, even more serious, you had the Cubans. Fidel Castro was a funny character. His island is far away, but he committed, during the time I was there, 25,000 Cuban soldiers. They increased to 45,000 soldiers in Angola. That's a major, major force. And they backed the Angolan army with military expertise, and they also participated in some of these battles. So here you've got the Cold War, a combination of various interest groups, and it's a boiling point. The boiling point was around about on Jiva Airport, if I may say that. And that is where I found myself. Now, on Jiva, served as the tactical HQ, so your operations commander will sit there. Why? Because he's close to the ground. He will report back to higher command, which is situated in Southwest Africa at Oshikati. They will report back to the capital, Windhoek, and Windhoek will report back to Pretoria. So there's a line of command, but the command stop at Onjiva. That's where Bataki hits Batar. Okay, so 32 Battalion on a continuous basis for at least the past 5-6 years were present in Angola, and at the point in time, 32 deployed 3 companies. Now, a company is 100 soldiers, and each company consisted of 4 platoons, let's say roughly 28 soldiers. So 300 soldiers were deployed in the area roughly 200 kilometers wide and 200 kilometers north of a border. So 300 people had to know what's behind every bush in an area spanning 200 kilometers. It's impossible. It is just impossible. But that was the aim. So in Angola, you had an area that runs up, let's say, about 285 kilometers. The battleground was as big as the Puma helicopters were capable of reaching and resupplying you, or assist you in the event that there's a casualty, to casevac and get the casualties back to safety. So that's roughly how big your operational ground is. So 32 operated up until Mupa. It's a missionary station north of Onjiva. Now, there were at that stage 2 permanent South African temporary, well, let's say temporary bases. So the one base I mentioned in Onjiva, and then to the west on the Kunene River, there was a place called Zangongu. So we had to secure that bridgehead there at the river, because you can only cross the river at the bridgehead, to make sure FAPLA don't come down and go over the bridge. So you had a base at Zangongu where 32 and sometimes 1 Parabat battalion soldiers were doing the protection of that area. And then to the north, and at later stage, I will also refer to a base we created at Ionde. So those were the 3 semi-permanent, let's say temporary bases South Africa ever had in Angola. And it was in 1983, and I was part of those bases, which was quite a coincidence for me. Now, sitting in Onjiva, I had quite some freedom. I could get into a convoy and drive 120 kilometers on Gongo, spend a bit of time there at the river, look around, walk around in Angola, and see a lot of things. I boarded helicopters and I was flown over the whole area. So as a signal officer, a reasonably junior person, I was exposed to a lot of things taking place in the war. I saw the war revolving around me. I sat in the operations room. The brigadiers and colonels and commandants were planning their operations. In the operations room, you've got a big map, and the signal room next door, because you had to talk to your soldiers. Now, I must be humble, but I'm prepared to say one thing. I think a signal officer in that situation is almost like a rock star. Just imagine if you have a concert, the guy sitting on the stage, he's got the microphone. The guy have a microphone is the person that runs the concert. And that same applies to a war area. If you have the communications and you are responsible for that, everything that is said and done goes through those radios. And that was my responsibility. So I, for 13 months, witnessed things taking place and how the war revolved. And that intrigued me a lot. Everything that got recorded, everything what's done gets reported. So you've got signals, signals that get sent to higher command. You've got your situation reports, your mine incident report. If there's a casevac injuries report, every day there were reports. So everything gets reported. And that all goes through my system where I was present. The map in front of us is a big wall map, but bigger than the wall behind me, where the whole operation area was on the map. So enemy movements and our soldier movements were planned on that map. And how did that take place? And let me just give you a bit of insight. And I'm not sure if we have much time, but how an operation room functioned. So you have an officer in command at that stage. This 2IB of 32 was Captain Jan Hougaard. Now, Jan Hougaard became a major and the commandant in the same year. Why? Because 32 was upgraded as a unit. So Jan Hougaard sat there and he gave orders. Now, he received intel from the people on the ground, but also from the intelligence source in Southwest Africa. So the likelihood where you will trace and detect enemy movement is then sent to the troops on the ground. So the troops on the ground had to make radio communication 4 to 6 times a day, mostly during the day, report their newest position, because it's always important to know exactly where your troops are, as for the planning. And then that information is then evaluated and decided, but are there enemy in the area? So if somebody saw any traces, tracks of enemy, the direction, how old it is, the operation was planned around that to find and seek and destroy the enemy before they reach the concentrated area where there's a big population in Wamboland. So Angola was fairly unpopulated at that stage. So the whole planning of operations on that map was done through the radios. Now you should understand, it was before the technological age we are now in. There were no GPS pinpoint your position. You had a small little map the size of a notebook. It's an aerial map which was issued to you. And there was no cell phones, networks, and definitely not the internet. So your means of communication was through a radio. A high frequency radio can reach up to 300 kilometers. And then you've got the very high frequency radios, what was used in the ground, on the ground, 5 kilometers, and with the Air Force aircraft. So that was a type of equipment the platoons carried with them. Now, we were issued with a very nice radio, B22. It's all sorts of advantages. It's that the disposable battery pack, very unique for the Defence Force. But that radio output was only 20 watts. Now, let me tell you, 20 watts is not much. To make communication in Angola, because you've got this flat surface, it's a sandy area, and the airwaves, that signal just disappears. At the HQ, we had a stronger radio, a TR-15 Hopper, which was 100 watts, so they can communicate with you. So now you've got the challenge. All this talking, all this communication must be coded, so the enemy who's listening in should not trace you, understand what you're doing, but you need the information from his troops. Now, you could not hear a guy speaking on the radio if he didn't have a good spot where he communicated with you. And that's where my signal team came in. Now, of course, let me tell you, those signatures were experts. You tend to have a person that have ability to listen to the faintest of sounds on a radio, to hear what is going on the other side, interpret it, read it back to the person with a positive or a negative response. And from that, the message or important information is gathered and given to the officer in command. That was a very important cog in the wheel. And that's why I say those signatures were like rock stars. If communication failed, that's the end of an operation. Even worse, if somebody gets injured and there were a lot of contacts and a lot of injuries, that person must be evacuated within 30 minutes. So you need to know where's the contact, send in the aircrafts, evacuate person, and save lives. All right, that's not more to say, but right. So I managed after 13 months to go to the archives of the South African Defence Force. And you won't believe it, because I got every single file that I closed 40 years ago. And that became the subject of my book of 2012. And what I wanted to do is to explain how this unit called 32 Battalion operated on the ground, even on a day-to-day basis. And let's just talk about 32 Battalion, why they were so special. 32 was sorted from the old FNLA, the guerrilla force troops, Chipanda section. Breitenbach, Colonel Jan Breitenbach, recruited them and took them to South Africa. They were supplied with proper uniforms, weapons, and then the leader group were selected people, officers and non-commissioned officers were selected to guide these people. Now, you should understand, we have special forces. They've got a specific role. The parabats are a very unique unit. I'm now talking about guerrilla-style counterinsurgency type of warfare. But to come across a group of people like these Portuguese soldiers of 32 Battalion is special. These people lived and stayed in the bush for 10, 20 years at the time. They know the bush. They were hardened. They had no fear. They were disciplined and they received orders. Now, there are not many such armies in the world I can think of, and I've done a lot of research that compares even slightly to 32. Now, what do you do with them? You put them in the bush for 6 weeks at a time, because they had to carry all their supplies in their Mashalla backpacks. And those backpacks are heavy. A backpack weighs more than a soldier's average weight, between 40 and 60, even more kilograms. And don't get me wrong, it's not a backpack that you pack and you take it from point A to B and you take it off and there's a target like modern war takes place. These guys lived through those backpacks and carried that backpacks for 6 weeks, moving 15, 20, even 25 kilometers a day in that Angolan thick bush and sand. It is unimaginable how it's even possible. In the dry season, you had to carry 8 liters of water with you and rations for 2 weeks. All your ammunition, radios, mortars, everything needs to be there. And obviously your gear. So these soldiers moved through this bush. They were a guerrilla force. And I believe they had to match the enemy. They had to beat SWAPO at what they are good at. So if SWAPO was a good guerrilla force, and let me tell you, some of those typhoon units of SWAPO was something. It's very specialized units. So you were contesting them. Now, it wasn't too long that Angola started fearing the Buffalo Battalion, which 32 Battalion was called. And you can read even books that's published later. There's no doubt about it. The fear that 32 caused into the enemy was significant. There was very little chance to engage 32 because of their fierce and angry way of which they did their fighting. So you had these platoons work in the bush 6 weeks at a time. Then there's a trooping taking place. They get replaced by another 3 companies. And while they're operating, they laid ambushes at familiar water holes, where they many times had contacts. They had observations positions. They had to seek the storage facilities of SWAPO. SWAPO had to store their ammunition and their supplies because of their long logistical track they had to take from their bases into Southwest Africa. So those caches, you had to find them. And obviously, if you discover a SWAPO base, an operation was planned in conjunction with the Air Force and other units to attack and eliminate those bases. Now, if you look at my 2012 book, 32 had contacts with SWAPO almost on a daily basis over a whole year. You can look at the records. You engaged 2 free guys, perhaps Typhoon guys, or some of the battalions when there were 60, 80 people in a battle. Some of the fighting took place, lasted a few seconds, but some of his fighting lasted for hours. And then, you know, there's a fierce battle going on. So in operations HQ, late at night, during the day, we got a message by radio, and it sounds like this: contact, contact, stand by. And you hear exploding bombs, and you hear fierce fighting and screaming of soldiers on the radio. And then you wait patiently, because the outcome would either be so many enemy soldiers are killed, or please send in the Pumas. We've got Kazakhs. And that's an important thing. If you give that soldier support, that if you are wounded, you'll be in a military hospital facility within 30 minutes, perhaps taken to South Africa, 5,000 kilometers to the south in a proper hospital. Those guys are prepared to fight to the end. And that is the accord that was struck between us and those Portuguese soldiers. At some point, I was tasked to join these platoons on the ground. I was flown in with a Puma helicopter. I did the patrols, carrying the Michela on my back. And I really understood these guys walk at the pace, walk through this thick bush, you know, this thorn trees that grabs your flesh. You got the mopani fleas that gets into your eyes. You run out of water, you get thirsty. The water you drink is perhaps of not human condition. And then your supplies need to last. Now, they were resupplied every 2 weeks. So you have to last with equipment for 2 weeks. Then you get fresh battery packs. You get your water during the dry season. And obviously, you get your rations. Now, after 6 weeks, you've got the trooping that takes place. Now, to take the one force out of a bush and put another force in its place is quite some task. But Puma helicopters had to fly hours and hours, taking out and replacing soldiers. And that became a very expensive exercise. Because flying time and helicopters, you know, you have to preserve your military equipment. At Onjiva, you had about 6 Alouette gunship helicopters, that's the small ones with a 20mm cannon, sitting there during day. At night, they had to go back to Southwest Africa, so they were not allowed in Angola. And then you had 4 to 6, perhaps 4 Pumas standing on the tarmac of Onjiva. So they were standing there ready. So in the event that there is a contact or there's traces of a base, they sent in those helicopters. Those Alouette helicopters had these 20mm guns, as I mentioned. And you had overhead protection during a firefight. Believe me, if those 20mm come into action and there's an enemy on the ground, it is not a nice sight to see. And there's a lot of successes and enemy kills was because of involvement of the Air Force and those Air Force pilots, perhaps some of the bravest men that ever walked the face of Earth. So we had a lot of support, and we are very good friends with the Air Force guys. Basically in 83, big operations took place. Operation Dolphin was during the year. There were about 3 big enemy base attacks. The one from a task force Oscar, they mainly consisted of, I think it was 4 Sai and 6-1 Meg. Now, you know, 3-2 had to locate the enemy and give reports back to the States. So if you know the enemy is moving in and you know the numbers, then the guys sitting on this side of the border, and those were the regular military units, that was the real South African Defence Force. They knew where and when to expect SWAPO to come in. And of course, the average, within 6 days after a SWAPO entered Southwest Africa, They were either eliminated or were driven out of Southwest Africa. And that in that vast and overpopulated area, that is quite a task. So that is a counter-insurgency side of a war. I'm telling you not about reacting. I'm talking about taking the fight to the enemy. And that is the other side of a war, fighting against SWAPO. So there was a base attack by 3-2 in early June, the 1st of June. 8 days later, you won't believe it, 6 Mac in their Ratel armored vehicles, they came across a SWAPO base unexpectedly, and there was a fierce fight between the Ratels and SWAPO, and that base was eliminated. A good success for 6-1 Meg. They suffered one loss of the staff sergeant that was killed. And then in October, the captain of that stage, Major Jan Hougaard, established that there was a large SWAPO base in the Juhala area, very north of a cat line. I think that was about 250 kilometers inside Angola. That's quite far. And a major operation was planned, and I had the task to do all the communication for that operation. So you had 2 or 3 3-2 battalion companies. They were flown in by Puma helicopters. Now, a platoon, 2 helicopters was needed to carry a platoon at about 14 guys with their kits. So 14 fit into a Puma helicopter. We established a temporary base. We call it a helicopter admin area, or a hack, close to the enemy base. And there was a lot of attention on 3-2. President Thomas, I think, was overseeing the operation at Onjiva. Brigadier Joop Joubert, the sector officer in command, was standing next to me in our temporary ops setup under a tree. Jan Hougaard was there, the Air Force guys. Who was he? So here we were planning this operation. So the operation started at each hour about 9 o'clock with the Impalas. You know, it's a jet aircraft flying in with the missiles, air-to-surface missiles, attacking the base. The next thing, you had stopper groups, 3-2 battalion at the recce group or recce wing, which was our small group setup. They had stopper groups as well as some of our platoons behind the enemy. And then as a sweeping force, the Pumas flew in 3-2 battalion. So you had this very interesting setup. This is how a war was fought, and I think that is how 3-2 was successful. So you soften the target. You've got mortars that is firing. There's a surprise element of the Pumas flying in the attacking force, and in a distance you had your stopper groups that will cut off the enemy fleeing. There was a great deal of interest. Unfortunately, with all the commotion, about 3 hours before we attacked the base, it got deserted. SWAPO never engaged our forces. The slightest sign of something going on, they bombshell and they ran in all directions. And you perhaps had 1 or 2, 3 kills. So yes, here you have this real stuff, the stuff that war is made of, but not with a great deal of success. But during the year, about 1,500 SWAPOs were killed. The SADF lost about 1,000 guys in 1983. Sorry, 100 guys compared to 1,500. And 3-2 was perhaps at the greatest stake in doing that. Right, so that was typically how that happened. In June 1983, we decided that 3-2 should move from Onjiva. Now, why it happened, you probably know Captain at that stage, Willem Ratte. He was officer command of a recce group of 3-2 battalion. Now, much can be said about Willem. Perhaps he should speak at some point if he didn't. But please, that's interesting. So Willems had a plan, and he said, well, there is this base to the east of Angola, about 120 kilometers north of the border. If we can get to that spot and make it a proper base, we will go in behind the enemy. So we were well situated. We can even drive with vehicles closer to the enemy. It's much central. There was a gravel runway, and you can reach your destination much easier. So it was decided to left on Jiva, and we started this base. Now, there are photographs of this base. It was underground facilities. We were bunkers. We had storage for ammunition and supplies. It was a proper base, beautiful place. I spent 6 months in that little area. On one side, you had an overview over a rivery area called the sauna. It's a marsh. Other side was a runway. There were high trees where we had cages where you sit and you could overlook the area. What a wonderful, wonderful place, designed by 3-2 for the purpose of what we were doing. The problem is now at Yaoundé, you are so deep into the bush, you couldn't get regular supplies. Now, can I just go back to Angola? Just last word about Angola. Angola, things are starting to heating up. There were a lot of supplies arriving. Some big operation was coming, and that operation got a name. It was Askari, and I'll talk about that. So remember, we're not in Angola. We were sitting, listening on our HF radios. You can trace some radio stations, and President P.W. Botha stand in Parliament, say with his finger pointing, "We were never in Angola. We will not be there." And you're sitting there, and you felt like, well, I must be mistaking myself, but this pretty much looked like Angola to me. So, but okay, that is the nature of war. So at one stage, it becomes so busy in Angola that they decided that they want to establish a permanent radio link. Now, a B81 radio is a radio probably as high as the roof of this room. Very sophisticated. It was a send and receive system, directional ultra-high frequency. So that radio had the ability, you can talk over radio like a phone. So it was sent and received simultaneously. It had a link to a base in South West Africa, in Inhana, and from Inhana it had a link to Oshikati, where was the main headquarters. Now, that is a very sophisticated system. And it was at the time I was there, and I was actually managing the insertion of this system. The only time a B81 network was ever created outside South Africa's borders, and never again afterwards. So the B81, I had to leave that behind. I had a teleprinter system. Your high secret coded messages only get sent by a teleprinter. That's a coded system. I had to leave that behind. So we established a new base, new communications, new systems, a new challenge at Yaoundé. Now we're really far away in the bush. There were no real trucks or roads reaching Yaoundé. The benefit is we were not reliant on the helicopters. You can put your troops into the bush by vehicle. You can even transport your troops from their base in Buffalo in the Caprivi on a vehicle. It's about 4 days drive, very heavy bundu bashing, bush breaking to get to Yaoundé. Never drive on roads because of the threat of landmines. So they were all benefits for Yaoundé. But now we are really remote. Now, Chris, you can just imagine, after 4 months, how did I look like? We didn't shave, we didn't cut our hair. We were bush monkeys. There was just no difference. Because we were performing our task. We were focusing at what we're good at. and that is running the operation and getting the results. So now we in Yaoundé. Yaoundé's got its own runway, and the operation is now taking place much deeper and further into Angola. So yes, much can be said about Yaoundé. Yaoundé was actually inside a minefield. You won't believe it, Chris. It was an enemy minefield. They cleared the area of enemy mines. And just after we started the base, all the heavy vehicles arriving there with, heavy loads. You've got axles for your logistical vehicles and spare parts. And as those vehicles entered that base, they started detonating landmines. It were anti-tank mines buried very deep. But sappers, engineering guys didn't trace those landmines. And I remember one day we were directing these vehicles because now you're inside that minefield. You never expected that. And I was directing the vehicle. I was just walking in front of one of these logistics. It was a Quairful. And the next thing, that anti-tank mine went off 10 yards from me. And it flipped me off my feet. I know when I came to my conscience, it was just dust and rubber. And obviously, my hearing was gone. It was total silence. So that was my landmine experience. Fortunately, I had not major injuries, but I couldn't hear. Now, just imagine a signal officer cannot use his hearing while talking on the radio. And it took me a while to hide my disability because I was afraid that I would be sent back to the States. And fortunately, some of my hearing did return. So, yes, they managed to clear that minefield and a lot of vehicles. It was interesting looking at the vehicle and watching this vehicle detonating a landmine. But the guy sitting behind the steering wheel, he hops like a rubber ball up and down the inside of that vehicle with his eyes that big. It's interesting. Fortunately, I think because the landmines were buried so deep, there were not serious damage, but obviously the vehicles were unusable. Right, so now we're in Yaoundé, operations continues, yes, interesting things. So one day, we had an unexpected call. A few SWAPO terrorists lost their way, and the next thing, they almost strolled casually right past our base. So here, you're sitting there in a observation post, and there's the SWAPO right in front of you. And one of my colleagues, he had this rifle with him. He cocked his rifle, and he started shooting at these SWAPOs, and they were running. And you won't believe it. Not one bullet hit one of those SWAPO guys. They ran over that flats, away from the bullets, and I was furious. How is it possible? But we've got this sophisticated rifles, and you couldn't even shot at the SWAPOs. I think they got their fright. I don't know what happened with them, but they were gone. So at the Yaoundé, we didn't have any luxuries. Not that we have luxuries on Jiva. So you bathed under a tree. We had dry rations for 6 months. Soya beans, perhaps if you were lucky for some nutrition. But it is tough. Really, that is a tough life. Some of my friends said perhaps I pulled the short straw when I got to Angola. Because remember, the infantry guys go in 6 weeks at a time, and then they go back to their home base for 6 weeks, where they spend a lot of leisure time. So they get trained there, and there's a lot of other activities. But they got winding down time. Of course, I was in that war for 13 months, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, on duty through the night, carrying that responsibility and having to make sure that everything goes 100%. Once in a while, you got what they called a sunspot. Now, a sunspot, there's radiation from the sun. And from sunrise to sunset, there's no communication. Everything is quiet. You get the sizzling sound on your radio. We had 3 of them. If there was a major operation, now, by the grace of God, let me tell you, if a sunspot, and nobody could break the sunspot, happened while the operation was taking place, you will wipe out a whole unit. 300 people's gone. And fortunately, that didn't happen. We had reliable communication throughout. So after I did my research, it appeared, Chris, that I was perhaps, and I'm humbled to say that, the only person that served 13 months inside Angola with a unit, uninterruptedly. I couldn't come across. Now, that's coincident. That's the era I was in. So because I was at that point at that time, and I had a certain job to do, and perhaps my OC didn't think of relieving me. So 30 months. So after that 30 months, I tell you, I was drained, and I needed to go back to normal society. There was just one small incident at Anjiva. I told you I've got two brothers also in the army. You know, we had to do camps and call-ups. And I and my second brother, we were at Anjiva. He was doing a camp there, and he was helping me out for a week or so. And as we were sitting under a tree, here comes strolling down the lane my third brother, my oldest brother. He's also in Anjiva. So they all three brothers meet up at the same base in Angola. I don't think that happened often. And because the helicopters departed that night, you know, you had to get on a helicopter. Sometimes, if you miss a helicopter, you can stay in the bush for 2 weeks for the next helicopter to arrive. And I had business to do in Ashikati. I had to go there from time to time. Because the only thing I ever see a female person, that was perhaps my OC's wife. I don't think he will really appreciate what I'm saying now, but at least to see a woman somehow. But okay, so we boarded, all three brothers, the same Puma. We've flown 40 kilometers or 20 out of Angola, and another, let's say 20, 40 kilometers in the same helicopter. Now, there was an instruction that brothers may not board the same helicopter. Just imagine if something happened to that helicopter, the whole family would be wiped out. Just interesting story that I need to share with you. Right, so that was that part. At the end of '83, the South African government decided to undertake a major operation. So this is perhaps a different chapter of our talk, and that is Operation Askari. And why I need to share Askari with you is I actually came across Askari. It was never told. So if I sit in my operation room and I look at the map in front of me, because the outer edges of a map, you'll find on the left Kahama. Now, Kahama's on the other side of that bridge at Zongongu. There was a brigade of FAPLA, and they were dug in. I think they talk about that that factory at in the Ukraine, Mariupol. They say the Russians suffered to get those troops out of there because that steel factory is an underground haven. It's all bunkers and tunnels. Now, Kahama was one of those positions. Now, Kahama wasn't really a threat to us because we're on the other side of the river. You take Kahama, what do you do with it? You just give it back. So you had Kahama on the left-hand side. On the right and outer edge of my map was Kaihundu. There was a brigade. They were more or less on the Kubangu or the Kunene River. Just on my map. And then in the north, you had places like Tsetsemetet, Cuvelai, Kasinga. Kasinga is very familiar. That's where Colonel Jan Breitenbach and the Parabas in 87, they took out SWAPO there, major operation at Ops Reindeer. And over that, in Dungo is also a topic of Ops Firewood, which happened at the end of the war. We had our most casualties. Right, so here you have these places. And the SADF, South African Defence Force, decided we're going to take those places. So they entered into Angola on the 9th of November. The operation actually started on the 9th of December. And they focused on Kahama. So they sent Task Force X-ray, mechanized infantry with rattles and rattle 90s, and multi-rocket launches. You know, we had that 126mm multiple rocket launches, which the communists also used. And they attacked Kahama, right then on your left. And there was a cut of, and now was a game. Then they go there and they withdraw. And they realized for the first time, the Russians had the T-54, 55 tanks, and they use it offensively. Before that, tanks were really dug in. It was almost like a stationary cannon, and they didn't move them anywhere. Now you had to face tanks heading your way, and those were sophisticated tanks at that point in time. Just remember, an infantry vehicle, an armored car, does not have, it's not a match for a tank. The armor is too thin, and your 90mm shot can't penetrate the tank. So there was a cat and mouse game there, and at some point, South Africa wanted to capture one of these air defense systems, the SAM-8 system, the most sophisticated air defense system in the world. And there was a cat and mouse game at Diba to try to lure them into some ambush to get that system. South Africa deployed our GARA, our unmanned aircraft. It's now referred to as a drone. First time that South Africa used a drone to seek this, and they fired at this drone. There's this interesting story that at some point late in the war, one of his drones was shot down, and UNITA, the rebellion force that was actually part of us, they came across this aircraft, and they had a search operation for weeks to find the pilot of the drone. And at some stage they said, no, they can't find the pilot, and we just had to make them believe that this is an unmanned aircraft actually. So, but anyhow, so they didn't manage to get the SAM-8 system, and they withdrew from Kahama. As a scam force, they tried to attack Kaihundu, that is now on your eastern side at the Kavango River. It was just to lure the attention of the enemy away and say, now South Africa is going to attack there. While this was going on, obviously 3 Battalion was very busy. So they operated in the area north of Cuvelai and east of Tsetsemetet and Kasinga, and they were looking for SWAPO. So they were very busy seeking bases, trying to get across bases, and they had a lot of action. Now, just after New Year, that's in January 1984, the OC of 3 Battalion that states, now I didn't mention Colonel Eddie Viljoen. Let's just stop here a while. Big Daddy, Ekio Victor or Eddie Viljoen, Colonel Eddie Viljoen, was the OC. He took over command of 3 Battalion in 1983 when I arrived at the unit. So he had a bit of planning to do, but then he gets involved. He was a fighting man. He was not sitting behind the desk. He was leading this force, 3 companies moving around, seeking SWAPO. Remember, our enemy is SWAPO, not FAPLA. And coincidentally, they walked into Tsetsemetet, which is a brigade strength base. Now, 4 rifle companies, motorized guys carrying lightweight machine guns, moving into a brigade, it is unheard of. But those FAPLA guys got the fright of their life. They believed there was something becoming, and those guys just fled the base. Without much effort, there was one tank incident they referred to, and there were a few interesting stories. If I can pause here, Koos Crocodile, Sergeant Major Koos Crocodile, a very, very colorful character. I'm sure you're going to talk to him as well. He tells a story, and I shouldn't give a story away, but I'm going to tell it. He and Peter Williams, they were with a recce group. They were seeking a SWAPO base, and they came across a river at night, and they realized they had to go through this river. Now, the rivers in Angola are not wide, they were deep and they're fast flowing. You know, it's typical that terrain there, they've got these rivers. And they had to cross this river. Now, the infantry troops can't swim. So as they got into this river, and the height is even higher, and now suddenly it's over their heads, some of these guys, and this at night, there's a SWAPO base just ahead. The guys started panicking, and this guy was shouting, I'm drowning, I'm drowning. And some of the guys in front says, stop shouting, I'm drowning. You giving our position away. Keep quiet. So we went across. At daybreak, they were just drying themselves out, and they came across a few locals, we call them povos. And their eyes were that big. They said, why are these guys walking through the river? Just look up. There's a bridge. There was an undetected bridge they could cross, and these guys went through the river. A quite interesting story that they shared. Also, the tank they came across, Koos Crocodile and Peter Williams, they got into this Russian T-54, 55 tank, and they just pull all the switches. It's all Russian, you can't make out what it's saying. And you know, those tanks have got this fire extinguishers, and that tank released all the white power it had inside in that tank. That guys crawled out of that tank, you would not recognize them from covered with that white smoke. But anyhow, by way of coincidence, but I think not only luck, because it was planned well, Free took a brigade without any effort. I think that is quite an achievement. But now, south of it, the 11th Brigade of FAPLA was situated at Cuvelai. Now, South Africa only managed once to go into Cuvelai. That is right at the beginning, Colonel Jan Breitenbach. So Cuvelai was a stronghold. And Cuvelai was actually a target. Now, after in this war, I mentioned 5,000 troops was committed to this Operation Askari. South Africa at least want one success rate. Setsemete perhaps is good, but they want one success story. And they want to tell the world we can capture a FAPLA brigade. That was not heard of. So the aim was then changed, that suddenly Cuvelai became a target in the middle of that war center, the war arena that I described. So they sent in a task force called a Task Force Delta. Now, these are citizen force guys who had their chance in the war. They know how to make war, but they come from civilian life. 82 Brigade, with Van Greiling, Commandant Van Greiling, the officer in command. So not only is South Africa attacking a brigade, but they sent in the reserve force to do the fighting. There was a group of foresight, but very small. So Van Greiling on the 31st of December 1983, he got the orders to attack a certain bridgehead. He was not happy. He complained. Perhaps his equipment was not up to it. They went in for the fight. Their mortar Lieutenant Liebenberg got shot through the turret of a rattle with a 20mm or perhaps a 36mm round. And it was all chaos. And the civilian guys withdrew. There was not a proper leadership. And the next day we were told, go into the fight again. We're going to again attack this base. Now, just you must understand. In modern warfare, you attack because it's a surprise. No target gets attacked once, twice, 3, 4 times. Because you've got one time at it. Because what? The enemy strengthened where you are and they expect you. Not in this instance. So Greiling wanted his guys to go back into the fight. And the citizen force members, very uncharacteristic for the SADF force, said, no, we're not going to into that attack. Now there's a situation. So Brigadier Joop Joubert from Sector 10 ordered the officer in command at Zongongu, you know, where they attacked and tried to get the SAM-8 missile. And they got a guy called Colonel Ep van Lille. I remember this name, Ep van Lille. Ep van Lille was part of that operation. At Kahama, he got an order to attack a certain place. And Ep signaled back and said, I'm going to attack, I'm doing this order. But today I'm going to forfeit a company. So just understand, today 100 people will die, but I'll follow this order. And then the High Command said, well, no, 100 people should not die that day. That was the type of man Ep van Lille was. So Ep van Lille was brought into this Task Force Delta. He created a new task force called Task Force X-Ray. He brought in his reliable leaders, and he was sitting there. Now, operations was planned months and months ahead with evaluations. Not this time. This guy flew into the outskirts of Cuvelai. He put his force together, and he makes a plan. And he decided on the 3rd of January to again, for the third time, to attack Cuvelai. He will use the Delta as a deviation force, so the enemy think they attack on this side, and then he'll go on the other side. So they should go first, and he should go second. Now, of course, if you evaluate all these operations, and in my last chapter of my book, I do a proper evaluation. How are you successful in guerrilla warfare in this conditions in Africa? And let's be honest, a lot of wars will still take place in Africa on the same style and the same way this war 40 years ago took place. So there's really a big lesson to be taught. So how do you attack a major base like this? It's no more a surprise. Now, you'll be surprised with this answer. You'll think it is a very sophisticated, long answer. First, you use the main access road to the base to attack the base. Now, a lot of generals watching this would say, this guy is mad. I'm sorry to say, that was a proven tactic. You use the main road. Why? In that area, you cannot see where the enemy is. That big bush is thick. There's not proper roads everywhere. So one way to ensure you get to your target is at least use the access road. Because too many fights, and you talk about Iheki and others, even Sabati, people missed the base. The target was not right in front of them, and that's where you get a lot of enemy fire and a lot of casualties. Now you attack them head on. So that is what Colonel Ep van Lille did. He drove on the road, heading towards the base with his deviation force. When the first shots got fired, he was looking around and he couldn't find his deviation force. Where are they? And you won't believe it. No, the deviation force wasn't deviation force. We're right behind him. So that plan is also not going to work. But he pushed through with his rattles. They went into that fight. One rattle was knocked out by a landmine. It was very late at night. They complained. Ep van Lille says, no, we're going to fight right through us. It fell dark and they had to turn around, course, and go back. That's the third attempt at this base. And then Colonel Ep van Lille says, well, tomorrow we'll do it the fourth time. That's the 4th of January. So what happened on the 4th of January? They got onto their rattles. They drove past this rattle that was already damaged. And they faced this enemy head on. In front of them were waiting 11 T-54, 55 tanks. All they had was a little Nordic cars, you know, the Eland 90mm little Nordica and the Ratel 90s and the Ratel 20s. Ratel 90 had a 90mm, but it's not a tank busting weapon. It is purely to enforce a lot of fire. So now they had facing 11 tanks coming at them. In the battle, one tank let's say missile, a T-54 tank, was firing at a Ratel 90mm. It missed a 90mm, and behind the 90mm was Ratel 13B, Corsair 13B, and it hit that Ratel on the door, incriminating everybody inside that Ratel. So 5 guys died there. McCaskill got an Horus Crux for bravery there, but it was a horrific scene. A tank hitting the target with his projectile. Sorry, the word projectile was one I'm missing in the story. Now there was a burning tank, and they just continued. Now, the whole story, there are actually 200 pages in my last book about how they took this objective, this target. So Ed van Hul pushed through with his men, irrespective of what happened the day before. And they managed to fend off. Now, there was also a helicopter pilot. His name will come to me now. He also got an Horus Crux, that is a bravery medal. He kept his helicopter just above the tree line, and he pinpointed to the artillery where the tanks are. And the artillery hit those tanks. Wasn't this for this one guy? I think it's Ahlers, Lieutenant Ahlers. That kept his cool because he received a lot of enemy fire, projectiles, and you must imagine there are 20mm anti-aircraft guns, the big 35mm aircraft guns. Because those heavy guns put on a ground roll, if you receive fire from those guns, it's a nightmare. Somebody told me, what win wars? Noise win wars. The deafening sound of war going into contact, I wasn't there, so I can just tell you what I heard, is what won wars. It is horrific, facing that. And the rate of fire, and you know, those 35mm projectiles, they shave the leaf of our trees. It's like a desert after those weapons fired. So that is what you're facing. Not only the tanks with a 100mm projectiles, but also this. So they managed to wipe out the enemy. And at nightfall on the 4th of January, Ed van Hul and his brave band of soldiers entered Cuvelai, and they take the target. And there the war, as far as I'm concerned, at that point in time was over, Chris. FAPLA realized that South Africa, with its bare minimum, can take out a brigade, and they've got nothing to throw at South Africa. That is why within a month, there was a ceasefire called by both SWAPO and Angola. They formed a joint military commission as part of a ceasefire to oversee what is happening in the southern part of Angola. So for all purposes, it seemed like the war was over, and Angolans didn't want to engage South Africa anymore. So that's the importance of that Operation Askari and the taking of Cuvelai. That ceasefire lasted for about a year and a half, and then it was back to normal. And then I don't want to go into that. That's when you had the big land battles at Mavinga and at Q2 Carnival during Operation Hooper, Packer, and Modular. And then it was the end of the war. Okay, So, yes, my involvement a year before Askari, I saw the planning, I saw something is happening, and then, like the cherry on the top of a cake, taking Cuvelai and Zetsemetet by 3 Battalion and 6-1 Mech guys, Forsyth and X-Ray. That was really a story, and you'll read the detail if you perhaps are interested to look at Move a Border. Okay, so after 30 months, I left the unit. There was a Thanksgiving ceremony, little thing just on the runway. And the guys got their little shields. It's a 3 Battalion special shield. And they didn't read out my name. And I realized that what happened. And it seems to that because I was in the bush so long, my name wasn't on the list. The guy who compiled the list forgot to put my name on the list, although I was 100% 3 Battalion. I mean, I've got my little 3 bush hat here, and I've got my beret here, and I think if you're 3 you earned it. So it was a bitter taste, not getting any rewards, but you know, being part of this group of people, and we still have our get-togethers. I think the next one is the end of May. We are veterans. We're now 40 years later, and we share these stories and we talk about it, and you get to know the guys. So it's lovely to be part of a group, special group of people. We were very close as veterans, and it is a brotherhood that I think you can't match. And I think you find it everywhere after conflicts of people sharing their stories. So, of course, I perhaps could have talked a bit longer. I think it's too much. But thank you for taking time to listen to what I have to say. My story is perhaps not about the guy shooting the enemy at point blank range in the head or that sort of thing. I was a signaler. I wasn't infantry. I've got admiration for the infantry guys. But I also have admiration for the guys who supported them, the medics that mended their wounds, the intelligence guys who told the infantry where to find the enemy, your sappers that cleared the roads for landmines, all of them, they played their role. I think it's important to realize that. But if you're in an infantry unit and you're part of 3-2, those guys are in the front. They take the bullets, and therefore I honor them for what they did. And I thank them to be part of them and that they accepted me as part of them. And I hope that these stories get told. That's why I wrote these books, Chris. But there is no doubt what happened, so that the generations to come would understand what price was paid for country and for our freedom. I'm not going to go into the politics. I think a soldier had a duty to play. And just at this point, in the late 80s, there were probably more black soldiers serving in South African military units than white soldiers. They were the Ovambos and the Kavangus. The culture of a military was of such that you can fit into that culture. And it is just something, it sucked you in. And it's so nice to be part of a winning military setup. So a lot of the work took place, and there you got formations formed like 101 Battalion in the Caspers and sort of things. And that ended up in an operation, and I'm going to leave you there at the end of this episode, Operation Firewood, 31st October 1987, where the Rekkies and the Parabats had the last engagement inside the SWAPO base of the war. Obviously, Cuvelai was not a SWAPO target. So significance of Cuvelai and Kahama, we attacked Fopla. South Africa was now prepared to fight the second battle. And that battle lasted up until 88, on the 22nd of December 1988, when the peace was finally signed. So in my time, we were fighting Fopla, we were fighting SWAPO, and we did a great job about it. And I'm proud of the guys who managed to be part of this. And I'm sorry for those guys, of course, that didn't come back. And that's why we honor them once or twice a year and think back about those guys. I mean, who am I to come back and tell the story and the other guy was left behind inside Angola? So that is tragic, but that is the nature of war. And that's why I think we live in a country, a wonderful country, South Africa, that's very promising for the future. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate your time.
I must tell you, yeah, Marius, and everybody listening here, but I absolutely love listening to historians. And I really loved your story, and I thank you for that. And you are invited back. If you want to come back and tell us about the books as well, specifically just concentrating on the books, you're more than welcome. We will leave the links for the books here also in the description and at the back of this video. So thank you for your time and your service. It's really remarkable to me what the army produced. Because we have to remember something. You were 17, 18 years old at this stage. And yet you speak like a man, you know, there's this wisdom in you. So thank you for your time, and for everyone listening here, please come and talk to us. It will do you good to talk, and it will do the history good, and it will do our tribe, the Afrikaner, and as South Africans, it will do us good to talk about these things. So until we meet again, God bless.